There are serial killers who commit their heinous acts for financial gain. Some have no respect for human life and will stop at nothing to achieve their dark goals, trampling over everything and everyone without remorse. However, the most evil ones kill for pleasure. They do it because the feeling of taking another person's life fills them with satisfaction. If we look through the annals of Hungarian crime history, we don't find many such monsters. But Lajos Balogh was one of them. Hungary's most ruthless killer was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1995 for murdering 4 people. At the time, the Hungarian Penal Code did not include the possibility of life without parole, so Balogh Lajos became eligible for conditional release after 25 years in 2020. However, due to a violent crime he committed in prison, his release date was postponed by 5 years, meaning he will only be eligible for parole in 2025. By then, he will be 59 years old. Born in 1966, Lajos Balogh grew up in a family with 4 children, an older brother and 2 younger brothers. According to his later testimony, his father regularly beat him from a very young age. Some sources suggest that Balogh even killed his father under unclear circumstances, though this was never proven. His first documented act of violence occurred at the age of 8, when he brutally beat his 4-year younger nephew to near death for no reason. On July 8, 1987, Balogh married his wife, whom he had known since childhood. Their relationship was only overshadowed by the fact that Balogh was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for attempted group robbery and theft, starting his sentence on April 23, 1992. He was released before serving the full sentence, but by 1994, his violent tendencies had returned, this time in an even darker form. Within his immediate environment, he saw himself as a dominant leader and imposed strict expectations on his family members, dictating how they should behave according to his own standards. This rigid control became the downfall of his wife's younger sister. Lajos Balogh disliked the 16-year-old girl's behavior, believing she spoke disrespectfully to her parents and had an insolent attitude. He finally decided to kill her when, at a family gathering, she, according to Balogh, once again spoke condescendingly to her father. On May 4, 1994, while helping paint at his brother-in-law's house, his trade was painting and decorating, Balogh began executing his diabolical plan. It worked in his favor that his wife's sister was complaining about not wanting to go to school. Balogh secretly arranged for her to meet him the next day in Shallambada. The unsuspecting girl agreed. On the morning of May 5, 1994, at 8:30 a.m., they met at the bus stop at May 1st Square. In Balogh's bag was a sharpened wallpaper scissors, a cloth diaper, and a belt. Despite the rainy weather, Balogh convinced the girl to go for a walk and lured her into a nearby wooded area. This marked the beginning of an 8-month killing spree that led to the gruesome deaths of 4 young girls. In the forest, Balogh began strangling his wife's sister, repeatedly punching her in the face. He stripped her naked and forced her to a nearby sand quarry. What followed was a series of brutal tortures. He tied the belt around her neck, kneeled on her back while strangling her, forced her to eat grass, stabbed her in the genitals with the scissors, then in the lower abdomen, and finally in the right side of her neck. Throughout the torture, he monitored her pulse to be aware of the moment she died. After several hours of unimaginable suffering, Balogh strangled the girl to death with a cord. When I started the act, I was probably more afraid than the victim herself. I was practically trembling, but by the time I was done, I thoroughly enjoyed it. So much so that at the moment she died, I actually felt sorry. Not for her, but because it was over. After the murder, Balogh felt an overwhelming sense of evil take over him. He later admitted that killing gave him joy, almost a perverse pleasure, and that he saw it as a game. The day after the murder, when his mother-in-law tearfully informed the family that the girl was missing, Balogh eagerly volunteered to join the search effort. For a few days, he managed to keep his crime to himself, but eventually, he couldn't resist bragging. He decided to tell his younger brother Tiber, the only sibling he kept in touch with. Tiber looked up to him as a role model, and instead of being horrified, he saw Balogh's crime as a display of dominance. As the police did not immediately suspect him, Balogh felt untouchable and decided to form a gang that would commit robberies and kill if necessary. He recruited Tiber and another young man named Christy into the group. Balogh expected them to obey him unconditionally. To prove their loyalty, he demanded that each of them commit a murder. Christian was the first to be tested. He was given 5 days to kill a chosen victim, a 14-year-old girl from Shishalambada, who had once been his girlfriend. Christus lured her into the same cursed forest, telling her they were going to shoot an air rifle with friends Balogh and Tiber. At a secluded clearing, Balogh signaled Christian to commit the murder. However, both Christy and Tiber hesitated, fearing they would get caught. Balogh flew into a rage. He punched the girl in the stomach, tore off her clothes with a 15-centimeter knife, tied her hands, and led her toward the sand quarry. Along the way, Tiber grew increasingly opposed to the killing, arguing with Balogh, who ultimately sent him home. At the quarry, Balogh raped the girl and then ordered Christy to kill her with the knife. When Christian couldn't do it, Balogh became furious. He stabbed the girl multiple times in the abdomen. Since she was still alive, he forced Christy to gather concrete and asphalt debris, which Balogh then used to crush her skull until she died. Drunk with power, Balogh mocked his gang members for their cowardice. Meanwhile, his wife moved back to Ard with their 5.5-year-old child, while Balogh returned to his mother's home in Shishalambada. They sold their shared apartment for 380,000 forints. Later, Balogh chillingly admitted, "I had to leave my wife and child, otherwise, one day, they would have become my victims. When the urge comes, there is no escape. I would lie beside my wife at night, watching TV, and suddenly I couldn't stop thinking, what if I strangled her right now? Killed her?" I dismissed the thought, but it kept coming back. Eventually, I imagined cutting her up in the bathtub, putting her in bags. Their plan included kidnapping people, murdering them while extorting their families. However, their dark discussion was interrupted by 2 young women jogging through the trees of the forest as part of their usual evening run. Balogh struck one of them with his pistol, while his brother and Christian tackled the other to the ground. They took their earrings and jewelry before Balogh led them toward the sand quarry. At a place known as Newell Dome Rabbit Hill, where his brother and Christian stayed behind, Balogh raped both victims. Afterward, he took them to a denser part of the forest, where he was rejoined by his brother. They forced the 2 young women to lie face down. Balogh then sat on the back of one of them and shot both in the head from a distance of approximately 20 or 30 centimeters. However, when he realized they were still alive, he pulled out a 22-centimeter dagger and stabbed them multiple times. Even then, their horrific suffering was not over. As the victims gasped and begged for mercy, Balogh checked their pulses and noticed they were still alive. With his brother's help, he continued to strangle, beat, and kicked the two innocent young women until they finally died. Balogh planned to extort 5 million forints from his wife's parents, falsely claiming he would release their missing daughter in exchange. On September 2, 1994, he called them in a disguised voice, demanding an urgent down payment of 500,000 forints, instructing them to throw the money from a moving train. The parents refused and alerted the police. Investigators took a voice sample from Balogh, which showed an 85% match with the ransom calls. Although this was not enough to arrest him, Balogh grew increasingly anxious. He returned to the crime scene and tried to dissolve the body with alcohol and hydrochloric acid. Meanwhile, he obtained a gun and plotted an armed robbery at a jewelry store. The police initially questioned Lajos Balogh as a witness in the extortion case. However, when the bodies of the two young women were discovered, followed shortly by the remains of his wife's sister, the officer leading the interrogation, based on the available evidence pointing to Balogh, immediately handcuffed and took him into custody. 2 days later, investigators from the Pest County Homicide Unit ordered a polygraph test. During a preliminary conversation before the lie detector was even attached, a criminal psychologist touched on a sensitive topic, prompting Balogh to confess to all four murders. He provided a full and detailed confession. Balogh opened up when he sensed that the psychologist was genuinely curious about him. "It's important that they understand what I did and why I did it," he stated. On January 9, 2025, the judge of the Budapest Metropolitan Court's Penal Enforcement Division reviewed the possibility of Balogh's conditional release, but ruled that the necessary conditions were not met. His release can be reconsidered no sooner than 2027. Thanks for watching. If you found this case intriguing, don't forget to subscribe for more mind-blowing mysteries. And why stop here? Click on one of these videos to uncover more chilling stories. See you in the next one.